Hi there, I'm Sam, and you're watching Historical Globalization Crash Course. And today we're going to talk about the Silk Road, so called because it was not a road and it was not made of silk. The Silk Road didn't begin trade, but it did radically expand its scope, and the connections that were formed by mostly unknown merchants arguably changed the world more than any political or religious leaders. It was especially cool if you were rich, because you finally had something to spend your money on other than temples. As previously mentioned, the Silk Road was not a road. It's not like archaeologists working in Uzbekistan have uncovered a bunch of yield signs and baby on board stickers. It was an overland route where merchants carried goods for trade. But it was really two routes, one that connected the eastern Mediterranean to Central Asia, and the one went from Central Asia to China. Further complicating things, the Silk Road involved sea routes. Many goods reached Rome via the Mediterranean, and goods from Central Asia found their way across the Pacific to Japan and even Java. So we shouldn't think of the Silk Road as a road, but rather as a network of trade routes. But just as now, the goods traveled more than the people who traded them. Very few traders traversed the entire Silk Road. Instead, they moved back and forth between towns, selling to traders who take the goods further toward their destination, with everybody marking up prices along the way. So what'd they trade? Well, silk for starters. For millennia, silk was only produced in China. It is spun from the cocoons of mulberry tree-eating worms, and the process of silk making, as well as the techniques for raising the worms, were closely guarded secrets, since the lion's share of China's wealth came from silk production. The Chinese used silk as fishing line to buy off nomadic raiders to keep things peaceful, and to write before they invented paper. But as an export, silk was mostly used for clothes. Silk clothing feels light in the summer and warm in the winter, and until we invented $700 pre-distressed designer jeans, decking yourself out in silk was the number one way to show people you were wealthy. But the Silk Road wasn't all about silk. The Mediterranean exported such cliched goods such as olives, olive oil, wine, and mustachioed plumbers. China exported raw materials like jade, silver, and iron. India exported fine cotton textiles. The ivory that originated in East Africa made its way across the Silk Road, and Arabia exported incense and spices in tortoise shells. Up until now on Crash Course, we've been focused on city-dwelling civilizational types, but with the growth of the Silk Road, the nomadic people of Central Asia suddenly became much more important to world history. Much of Central Asia isn't great for agriculture, but it's difficult to conquer unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols. It also lends itself fairly well to herding, and since nomads are definitionally good at moving around, they're also good at moving stuff from point A to point B, which makes them good traders. Plus, all their travel made them more resistant to diseases.
One group of such nomads, the Yushe, were humiliated in battle in the 2nd century BCE by their bitter rivals, the Yangshu, who turned the Yushe king's skull into a drinking cup, in fact. And in the wake of that, the Yushe migrated to Bactria and started the Kushan Empire and now what is Afghanistan and Pakistan. Although Silk Road trading began more than a century before the birth of Jesus, it really took off in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of CE, and the Kushan Empire really became a huge hub for that Silk Road trade. By then, nomads were being eclipsed by professional merchants who traveled the Silk Roads, often making huge profits, but those cities had been founded by nomadic peoples became hugely important. They continued to grow because most of the trade on the Silk Road was by caravan, and those caravans had to stop frequently, for like food and water and prostitutes. These towns became fantastically wealthy. One, Palmyra, was particularly important, because all of the incense and silk that traveled to Rome had to go through Palmyra. Silk was so popular among the Roman elite that the Roman Senate repeatedly tried to ban it, complaining about trade imbalances caused by the silk trade, and also that silk was inadequately modest. To quote Seneca the Younger, "I see clothes of silk, if materials that do not hide the body, nor even one's decency, can be called clothes." He also said of the woman who wears silk, "Her husband has no more acquaintance than any outsider or foreigner with his wife's body." And yet, all attempts to ban silk failed, which speaks to how much, even in the ancient world, wealth shaped governance. And with trade, there was a way to become wealthy without being a king or lord who takes part of what your citizens produce. The merchant class that grew along the Silk Road became to have a lot of political clout, and in some ways that began the tension we will still see today between wealth and politics. Whether it's, corporations making large donations or Vladimir Putin periodically jailing billionaires. Mr. Putin, I just want to state for the record that I did not mean that in any way. I was I did not mean that in any way. It's just fucking.
Sam, why you zoomed in so fucking hard?
What the hell are you doing?
It's done on the entire video.
Just chill.
That's a clean 60 FPS.
Yeah, it is. Let's go from like the beginning of the paragraph.
Did the Silk Road affect the rest of us? Yes, for 3 reasons. First, wider economic impact. Relatively few people could afford silk, but a lot of people devoted their lives to making that silk. And as the market for silk grew, more and more people chose to go into silk production rather than doing something with their lives. Second, the Silk Road didn't just trade luxury goods. In fact, arguably the most important thing traded along the Silk Road: ideas. For example, the Silk Road was the primary route for the spread of Buddhism. When we last saw the Buddha's eightfold path to escaping the cycle of suffering and desire that's inherent to humans, it was beginning to dwindle in India. But through contacts with other cultures and traditions, Buddhism grew and flourished and became one of the great traditions of the world. The variation of Buddhism that took root in China, Korea, Japan, and Central Asia is known as Mahayana Buddhism, and it differed from the original teachings of the Buddha in many ways, but one that was fundamental. For Mahayana Buddhists, the Buddha was divine. I mean, we can, and religious historians do, fight over the exact definition of divine. But in Mahayana Buddhism, there's no question that the Buddha is venerated to a greater degree. The idea of nirvana also transformed from a release that cycle of suffering and desire to something much more heavenly and frankly more fun. And in some versions of Mahayana Buddhism, there are lots of different heavens, each more awesome than the last. Rather than focusing on the fundamental fact of suffering, Mahayana Buddhism offered the hope that through the worship of Buddha, or one of the many bodhisattvas, look at this word. Bodhisattvas.
Bodhisattvas.
Rather than focusing on the fundamental fact of suffering, Mahayana Buddhism offered the hope that through the worship of the Buddha, or one of the many bodhisattvas, holy people could have achieved nirvana, but chose to hang out on earth with us because they're super nice. One could attain a good afterlife. Many merchants on the Silk Road became strong supporters of monasteries, which in turn became convenient way stations for caravans. And by endowing the monasteries, rich merchants were buying a form of supernatural insurance. Monks who lived in the monasteries would pray for successive trade missions and the health of their patrons. It was win-win, especially when you consider that one of the central materials used in Mahayana Buddhist rituals is silk. And the third reason the Silk Road changed all our lives, worldwide interconnectedness of populations led to the spread of disease. Measles and smallpox traveled along it, as did bubonic plague, which came from the east to the west in 534, 750, and most devastatingly, 1346. This last plague, known as the Black Death, resulted in the largest population decimation in human history, with nearly half of Europeans dying in a 4-year period. A sizable majority of people living in Italy died, as did 2/3 of Londoners, and it quite possibly wouldn't have happened without the Silk Road. If you were living in London during the 14th century, you
probably didn't blame the Silk Road for your community's devastation, but it played a role. If you look at it that way, the interconnectedness fostered by Silk Road affected way more people than just those rich enough to buy the silk. Just as today's globalization offers both promise. That was really fast. Okay, let me restart that last one. What the fuck?
Stop fucking zooming in on his face.
Cannot
Mo, stop.
Okay,
Just trying to blow
try and delete that whole last video. That was way too fast. Try and slow this time. Oh, if you were living in London during the 14th century, you probably didn't blame the Silk Road for your community's devastation, but it played a role. If you look at it that way, the interconnectedness fostered by Silk Road affected way more people than just those rich enough to buy the silk. Just as today's globalization offers both promise and threat to each of us. Thanks for watching.